So welcome. Today we're going to be talking about a little bit about academic writing, how to organize yourself, how to organize your thoughts, specifically on how to write the term paper for Physiology 214. But there's also a lot of general knowledge and general tips that you can incorporate into any academic writing assignment, and we'll go through those as well. Oh, I guess I also forgot to introduce my collaborators, Mizuki and Jasmine. They'll be helping me throughout this presentation today. All right, so the general outline for today is we're going to go through some common mistakes, what things that usually students do and then end up not doing well, going through some of the planning of how you can set yourself up for the research part and sort of organize yourself before you even get to reading papers and figuring out what you're going to write. We're also going to go through the actual research portion, how to efficiently read papers throughout the stages of the project, and also how to do notes and citation management and all that. And then we'll end off with paper organization. So we're going to be mainly focusing on some writing tips to do with the introduction and conclusion, and we won't focus too much on the body of the actual paper, as a lot of that just comes with some of the other planning and research tips that we'll give in the first three of the sections. Okay, common mistakes. How do you set yourself up for success? And that's just avoiding some of these mistakes. One of the biggest things is not answering the question. So if the topic is has multiple parts to it, sometimes in the frenzy of trying to read a bunch of papers and trying to answer some of the questions or some of the sub-questions, you may miss part of the question, and I think that is probably where a lot of students lose marks. You can write a stellar paper, and if you're really missing part of the point of what that instructor is looking for, you obviously are not going to be getting the best grade that you could possibly get. And the other part of it is focusing too much on pathophysiology. So specifically for the term paper, it's meant to cover a lot of the physiological aspects, and it does come with a caveat. Like, that recommendation does come with a caveat, which is basically that some topics are pathophysiologically heavy, and you can tell just by reading the topic that that's what they're looking for. But for the most part, most topics will require you to dive into the physiology and avoid the pathophysiology until the very end, instead of spending like the entirety of the paper talking about it. But again, that does come with the different topics, but that is some feedback that I have heard some students get, that they focus too much on pathophysiology or too much on clinical intervention rather than focusing on the actual mechanisms of how stuff works. The other thing is not reading enough papers. It may come as a shock, but if you are given a 15 citation allotment, you should be reading at least 15 papers. And the recommendation that I personally give to whoever I talk to is you should probably be reading double if you want to do really well. And that does sound like a lot for most second-year students who haven't had a lot of experience reading papers, but it ultimately comes down to reading the right part of the paper and going through the right stages of that reading process. You don't necessarily have to read like an in-depth read-through of every single one of those 30 papers. There's sort of a step-by-step stage or a staged reading process that you can start honing in on specific parts of the paper that you'd like to cover, and that makes it easier to cover more material and have a little bit more depth to your knowledge before you start writing. And then the third thing is not simply restating. So it can be easy to just take, it is a review, so to a certain extent you are trying to summarize the field, but it's also important not to take some of the reviews that you read in the initial bit of your readings and your research process and sort of restate everything they're saying. You want to cover a little bit of nuance, a little bit of interpretation, try to take the results from the papers that you read and incorporate them into something that's not necessarily novel. We're not really at that stage yet with a second-year physiology paper, but you want to make sure that you're not simply restating what other reviews have already said. And lastly, you want to know your audience. First of all, we'll talk a little bit about tone at the very end, of how you should be phrasing your sentences, how you should be phrasing the general flow of your paper. But one thing to note specifically for the physiology paper is that a lot of these professors are experts in their field, and they have written a lot of the papers in the field that they have chosen for you. So a lot of the time you'll run into papers that professor has written, and it's important to make sure that you make a note of that and you cover those papers specifically in more depth, because it's a little bit embarrassing if you summarize the wrong results for a paper that professor has written. So that's something to note. But just know that your audience is a sophisticated audience. They're experts in that field, and a lot of times they've written a lot of the papers within that field. All right, I'm going to pass it off to Mizuki for the planning portion.
Yeah, so this part is just going to be how you can get started with your paper and how you can make sure that your paper is organized enough and clear to your readers, and really just get you started with the whole writing process. So we're going to go through 3 basic parts of the planning stage. The first part is just going to be dissecting the topic. So this is really just really understanding the topic that you are going to be covering and knowing exactly what the specific parts that should be included in your paper would be. After that, we recommend going through some scientific review articles just so that you can really get a good grasp of the topic that you're going to be covering in your paper, and also get a good understanding of where the current scientific community is in terms of their knowledge, so that you can really be up to date with the paper that you're writing. And then lastly, just a general outline that you can build so that you can really get started with that organizational flow for your paper. And this will just include these smaller questions that you want to answer within your paper, and just really make sure that the paper is nice and easy to follow for your reader. So going a bit more specifically, first with dissecting the topic. So a good way to do this is to start asking yourself some sub-questions. So really look at the question that's asked of you for your topic. And so for example, in this question, or in this example that we have at the bottom here, you really want to outline kind of what are the main points that are being asked of you. So for example, we talk about noradrenaline here, and it also includes this specifics about synaptic strength and memory loss and PTSD. So you want to make sure that those are topics that you're going to include in your paper because they're specifically asked in that question. And then of course, not ignoring the details, such as the fact that it's, in the mammalian hippocampus, and the detail of that, the scientific articles that you want to look at are going to be from the past 15 to 20 years, for example. So just looking at those smaller details within the larger topic and making sure that you don't ignore those when you're starting to make those more specific subtopics that you're going to be talking about in your paper. And then just to get you started, read lots of reviews. So you really want to be able to have a firm grasp on what the topic really is and what is currently known on the topic. So, just go out and find some scientific reviews on the topic. 2 to 3 is probably pretty good, a pretty good start for just getting to know the topic. And you want to be able to, summarize what you know, summarize what the scientific community knows, and then know what's really these emerging evidence or emerging knowledge versus what is something that's kind of this long established knowledge that the scientific community already knows, so that you can really include those important topics. And then a good thing with these review articles is that you can go in and look at the citations that they use. And this is a really good way to start looking for sources that you could use as well. So at a lot of the review articles will have, a huge list of citations that they'll have used, and you can go through and look for ones that might be of interest to you or would be particularly useful for your topic. And then that can just be a good start or a good jumping off point for just starting a list of papers that you could potentially read and include in your paper. And then finally, making the outline. This is just going to be a really general overview of how you're going to organize your paper. So the way that I personally like to do it is, once you've asked yourself what the questions are, what the sub-questions are of the topic, you can start making those subheadings that you'll include in your paper. And in this, you just want to be, cognizant of what are the main topics you're going to cover in your paper, what are your paragraphs going to be consisted of, and really make sure that the flow of those topics makes sense. So are you jumping back and forth, or does it, do you start off with something really specific and then go into something more general? You want to make sure that it's really understandable for your readers. So, start off with maybe a more general concept and then go into more detailed topics later on. And then once you've made those subheadings, you can go in and fill in a bit more specific details within those subheadings. So you can go in and include specific points that you want to include within those subheadings, or if you found maybe some noteworthy papers, either through your own search of articles or through the review articles that you found, you could include those within the subheadings as well. And I'm just going to show you a quick example of what an outline could look like. So yeah, everyone's outline will look different, but this is just one example. So this is for a different topic, but this is just a really brief example. So, you have your intro and then you have these subheadings of what you might want to include for your paragraphs. And then within that, I personally included the papers that I would use within these subheadings, but you could also, include specific points or details that you might have found within the review articles that you read that you think would go well under these topics. And then from there, you kind of have a good understanding of the flow of your paper and where you kind of want to take it. And then it'll make it a lot easier to start writing so that you don't, end up going all over the place or get confused about where you are. You can always refer to your outline and know exactly what order you want to follow and what information you want to include. Okay.
All right. Okay, so I'm going to go into the actual research part, and this is mainly just the workflow. We'll talk a little bit about when it comes back to efficient paper reading and the different stages of your reading process. But first, I want to cover some of the tools that you can use. And these are tools that you sort of get as you get more experience in research and in writing papers and stuff like that, you'll become very familiar with. But I'm not sure how many second years actually get to use these tools. I understand that these are available to them. So I just want to go through some of these tools and make sure that you can make use of them to increase your efficiency when you read papers. So first of all, we'll go through PubMed. Then we'll talk a little bit about citation managers. And then I have a couple examples of note organization that falls a little bit under that planning category, but a little bit more in terms of like how are you going to extract information from the papers you read. All right, so first of all, what I recommend is that you make an account with PubMed. So a lot of these research papers you're going to be able to find on PubMed, and so it's really useful to create an account, and you can do so through your institution associated email. And so that sort of allows you to save a lot of information as you're reading. So if I'm, for example, interested in long-term potentiation, and I'm specifically interested in this article. Seeing that as I'm logged in, I can do a number of things. I can send it to Clipboard, which will sort of save all the citation information for this. There's also options to send it to your bibliography, to your citation manager. I'll actually present an alternative to using these features. I haven't used them myself. But the biggest thing is that you want to be able to send it to collections. And so that'll save it to a folder. So if you have a specific project that you've made a collection for, you can go ahead and add this paper to that collection. So LTP, add. Great. Now here I can go to my dashboard. And I can see my collections right here. And you can see that this is the only thing, there's only one result in my collection, so it goes straight to this paper. And so this can be a little bit useful as, for example, if you are looking for a long-term potentiation and there are a lot of papers on the topic, you can go ahead and start reading through just the titles as a way to narrow down exactly what you're going to read. You can just go through the titles, and you can go ahead and just go like, you select each of the papers that you're interested in reading, or at least interested in reading the abstracts of, and then you can go ahead and send to your collections, and that allows you to sift through a lot more papers a lot more quickly. And an additional benefit is once you're actually in the collections folder, you're able to actually read the abstracts all together. So if we go to my dashboard again, going to LTP. Oh, still one result. That's an error there. Okay, point is you will be able to download all the abstracts from all the papers that you've selected, as well as the title. So you can just make a huge list of papers you're interested in, go through and read the abstracts and select which ones you feel are most pertinent to your project, and then you can read those specifically. One thing to note too is for specific papers, like this one is PMC, and PMC usually are free full text articles. Sometimes if it's, for example, something in Nature, like a Nature review or Nature communication, a lot of those times those are not obviously free articles. This is much older, so that might be it. But sometimes you'll be hit with a paywall. So usually if you're logged in and you've been reading a lot of papers, it'll recognize that you have a university associated or institution associated account. In this case, this article is actually free, so you're able to read it quite easily. But in some cases, it's going to hit you with a paywall, in which case you have to use what's called an easy proxy link. So if I can find an appropriate, there we go, this might be it. There we go, Nature Publishing usually does this. So let's just say I want the PDF. Every example I've picked seems to be working. Anywho, if there's a case where you have a paywall and you're not able to access the article, what you can do is, there's a easy proxy prefix, and you can search this up as easy proxy uAlberta. And there is just this link that you need to paste before the link of the article you have. So if I have this specific prefix, if I go here to my article, and I can just paste it before the start of my article or my URL for that article, and it'll load it through the easy proxy portal, and it'll allow me to see all the papers that the university has a subscription to. One alternative to this, if you don't want to constantly be copy pasting, and usually if you do this once, it'll recognize it for the future, and you can see here that it says University of Alberta. But one easy way that you can circumvent a lot of this work is by getting what's called a easy proxy redirect extension. So right here, it's not going to let me do this right here. So it's called an easy proxy redirect extension, and you can find that just by going to your Chrome web store, and you can add this to, if you're using a Chrome browser, it'll be a lot easier. Right now I'm using Microsoft Edge, which runs on a Chrome platform, so I'm able to use these web tools, and I can add it to my extensions bar, and I can reload just by hitting this button, and it'll reload with the prefix so that I have access to those papers. So next point is citation management. There's a couple different tools that are available to you. One of them is RefWorks. RefWorks is usually subscription service, but through the university, if you go through the library, you can actually gain free access to ProQuest RefWorks, which is a citation manager. One downside to this is that you have to do a lot of the work in terms of you can definitely add and import references, and I'll show you how to do that based off of PubMed. But something you can't do is directly integrate it into whatever word processor you're using. So one of the benefits of using a platform called Mendeley is that there is an app for Windows and for Mac that allows you to not only add citations from your list of collections or whatever papers that you found, but there's also a web importer and a citation plugin, and the citation plugin specifically is for those word processors. So you can avoid the work of having to constantly update your reference list manually. So the way that works is you want to download the Mendeley app, Mendeley desktop. Make an account, and the account is free. So as you can see here, I have the citation plugin installed as well. These are all the citations through my entire library, but I also have them broken down specifically by projects. So specifically for this paper, I had a bunch of citations that I've added. And the way that you can add these citations is just going to the paper that you're reading, clicking on Cite, and then you're going to click on Download NBIB file. You're going to download that. It's going to come up with a specific code. You can do this one by one to make it easier, but then all you do is click on Add, and then from your Downloads folder, you can click on that, and that has been added right here. So you can see that that has been added to your citation list. And so if you are writing a paper, pull one of these up. I have a new document that I'm doing my research in, something about nature, and I want to do references. So you can see if I go to my references tab, I have this plugin called the Mendeley Citomatic, and what I can do is I can insert a citation, nature, and I can do either through the name of the article or through the author. Nature-based solutions. Right here. And that's added that in. In this case, this is sort of a bad citation because it didn't have any authors listed in the NBIB file, so it's going to come up weird, where it's just going to drop the full name of the article. And that's going to also depend on what citation style you're using. So in this case, I'm using APA, but for your physiology paper, you're likely going to be using the American Physiological Association. And in that case, you're not going to actually be able to see all that information. So if I go to American Physiological Society, you can see that it's a 1. Now, if I have multiple citations, as you may have imagined, a lot of people, when they do their physiology paper and they have their 15 citations, every time they add a new citation and that order changes, they have to go in and manually change the numbers. That's going to waste a lot of your time. You don't want to do that. So by using a citation manager, not only are you keeping track of all the papers that you've read and all the citation information without having to save a lot of that on a separate document and go through all that hassle, but you can also, once you input the citation, all these numbers will automatically update as the order of the citations changes. So if I have multiple different citations, and let's just say I have something else and I cite that, let's just cite this paper, you can see that number has changed and I don't have to manually change it. Additionally, you can also drop a bibliography. So you can just say insert bibliography at the end of your document, and it's going to format it specifically to the style that you have chosen, and it's going to drop it at the end of your document. And again, the numbers will correspond to the order that is in your document. And what's great about this too, as you may have noticed earlier, is I was able to change the style at will. So if you're at the start of your paper writing process and you want to see which specific papers that you have used so far, you can switch it to APA so that you can see the authors. So you can see the authors, and that makes it a lot easier to visualize which papers you've already used. And then at the very end, where you need to get a sense for word count and also shorten it because you're limited to 5 pages, you can switch it back to American Physiological Society, and that makes it a lot easier to manage. So that's the pipeline for the for Mendeley. Highly recommend that you explore that tool. One additional thing I want to show you with that, and this is going to be limited to Microsoft-based browsers, from my understanding. So if you are on Windows and you are using Chrome, and you'd like to use this tool, what I would recommend is get Microsoft Edge. It's not like the original Microsoft Edge browser. This is built off of Chrome. So it's a lot faster, and I have my own preferences when it comes to this browser. But one benefit is that you'll also get access to the Mendeley web importer. And what that will allow you to do is open up your reference list straight from this window. So if I'm on PubMed and I click on this, the web importer will load all my searches from this term that I've searched. So specifically, I'm in here. But if I go to search results and I click on web importer again, it's going to take a second to load. But then it's also going to find the 10 articles that are on this page and show me all of them at once. And all I have to do is just click, and then I can say add to my library, or I can add it to a specific collection that you saw in the Mendeley app. So these are the collections right here in my library. And so I don't have to go through the process of downloading the NBIB file from the page that has the article. I can go ahead and just add it through the web importer, and that makes it a lot easier and saves you a few steps along the way. And then last thing I want to talk about with this organization is when it comes to managing your notes. So I have 2 examples here. So you may have noticed that I've switched my approach a little bit. So this was last year when I was doing citations in my notes. And you may see that some of them have full citations, some of them have just the DOI, which is going to be the digital identifier for a lot of these papers. That was just how I was managing, because I didn't want to input all these citations into Mendeley and not know which ones I was actually going to use, given that I was reading upwards of 30 papers to meet that 15 citation limit. And so I didn't know exactly which ones I wanted to use, and I didn't want to crowd Mendeley with all those citations. So all I did was I dropped the DOI for the article in the citation section of these tables. As you may notice, what I have it broken down into is that I have the article title, I have the citation to make it easier for me to find the reference later, and you can do that however you like, either through the DOI, or you can do it through, like I did it here, where I actually added the citation in APA to this area. And the reason for that is this, I had a citation limit, this I did not have a citation limit, so it didn't matter what things I cited, and so I ended up citing every one of the papers that I read, and that's just how it worked out. But in this case, you can do it through the DOI method, and that's completely okay. And so for the reading process, I've just gone ahead and I've made notes, and I've hyperlinked if there are specific ideas that are referenced later on in the research. So I have it either hyperlinked to articles that I've read. So these are either going to be hyperlinks to the papers online, or they're going to be hyperlinks to specific parts of this document that will link different ideas as I read through. And as you can tell, the first one is a review. So I go through an in-depth read through, and I try to establish all the different things that are known. And you can tell that there's a lot of notes for this specific article. Similarly, for the first few, there's a lot of notes, but as you can tell, the more I read, the less I end up writing. Like these end up becoming a lot shorter, because what you're actually searching for narrows down. And I can talk a little bit about that in a second. But I just want to draw your attention to this also, and this is something I also did to help me, which is I wrote seminal to papers that I found were sort of groundbreaking. So in this specific project, I was researching how Mozart's classical music, specifically this one piece that he wrote, seemed to improve spatial task performance. And so there was one paper published in Nature in 1993 that was able to show that, and a bunch of papers after that that were not able to replicate. But I just marked it as seminal. This was the paper that first showed the effect. So that just was reference for me. And I also made notes on the design of the paper, because if there's going to be issues with replication later on, I also need to be thinking about the design of the paper, what could have gone wrong, or what was different in the design of this paper relative to the other ones that may have been the difference in their results. Other than that, it's fairly standard. Again, these tables are the way that I like to organize my thoughts, and again, I just take notes on the different aspects of the paper, and they end up becoming sort of shorter and shorter as we get into the research process. So as you may notice too, like this, I've read a lot of papers and the notes are overkill. So these are like 4,000 words in notes, whereas your paper is probably going to come out to 1,200, 1,300. And also you have a citation limit of 15 citations. So it's always good to read more and then cut back on what you're actually going to talk about once you start writing. And then the last thing I want to cover is the different stages of reading papers. So the way that I like to think about it is that it comes in 4 stages. The first part is we've already talked about. You need to read reviews, 2 to 3 reviews at least, more or less depending on whichever topic that you've chosen. But the first stage is establishing your baseline knowledge of the field. A lot of these topics you've obviously not been taught in class, so it's really important that you get a fairly good understanding of what you're getting into before you jump right in and get into these papers. And oftentimes the reviews are a lot easier to read because they're less about the breaking the larger questions down into smaller and smaller things. They're just summarizing. And so summary is obviously easier to read. So it's a lot better to get into the review than to just jump right into full papers. Stage 2 is to review the papers cited in the reviews and do full paper in-depth read-throughs. And this is the part about it being cited in the review. That's up to you. That's the way that I like to start, is just going through those citations instead of doing my own search. But if you do your own search, the main important idea here is that you need to do a full paper in-depth read. And that's just going through the entire paper from introduction all the way to discussion to get all the information you can get and extract everything from that paper. You only need to do that for the first few. So as I mentioned, if you have 15 citations as the limit, you should probably be reading 30, 20, 25. And so for the first few, you can read the full paper. But as you may notice, if you're focusing on a lot of papers that are in the same field, the intro is going to be the same. The methods are going to be very similar. And so you don't need to go through every single one of those sections every time you read a paper. So stage 3 is you just read the abstract. What is it that I want to gain from this paper? And then you jump right into results and discussion. Most of the time for me, when I get to the end of stage 3, I'm not even reading discussion, because at this point, the baseline knowledge of what I understand from the field is good enough that I can interpret those results without being told the interpretation. And a lot of times, if you're reading every paper that's published in Nature that's trustworthy, that's good. And with some faults, obviously, that paper in 1993 was published in Nature and ended up being wrong. But if you're reading a wide variety of journal articles, you should probably be interpreting the results rather than relying on a discussion to interpret it for you. And that's just a way to ensure that you trust the data rather than completely relying on whoever is presenting that information to tell you what's going on. And then the last stage it's a little bit of a step beyond what is really required, and it's really going to be dependent on how well you think that you can pull this off. But I would actually go one step further and read papers that are related to the field but outside of that field. So specifically, there was when I was writing my paper on long-term potentiation, there was a drug being tested in a completely different field for a completely different purpose, but physiologically it made sense to fit into the framework of long-term potentiation. And so I read a couple papers on that drug and tried to bring that information into my paper to say that potentially dealing with a lot of these effects on like rampant fear memory and all that in PTSD, this drug might be a solution. And that's really like I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because again I'm not an expert in the field, but it's sort of just like dropping that little bit of extra information, a little bit of extra what I call nuggets to make your paper a little bit more interesting and a little bit more impactful. Okay, and that's it for my portion. I'm going to hand it off again to Jasmine.
Okay. So I'll be talking a little bit about paper organization, or essentially how to have better flow in order to guide your reader through your paper itself. So we can flip to the introduction. Okay, so your introduction to essentially act to provide context or background to your paper. So kind of general information regarding the topic itself, the current challenges being faced, or some of what the current literature is saying. And it should move from broad to specific organization and essentially an information. It should also cover your thesis, so your paper's purpose and what you hope to accomplish, and essentially give a general overview of what you will be talking about throughout the entire paper. And it's important at this point to avoid kind of guiding statements like this paper will discuss, because your reader at this point can and should assume that anything that you're writing or the points that you're making will be discussed at a later point. So there's no need to split it. Your conclusion. Oh, sorry, we'll go over some examples now. But these are two examples of introductions that for papers that did quite well in Civil 212, I believe. So essentially the beginning portion of unhighlighted information is that contextual background info. And then the highlighted portions are main topics or points or subheadings that ended up taking up big chunks of the paper as you kind of move through the body. So as you can see, for the first example, there's actually no citations, which is actually a little bit more uncommon. But that's just because for the first example, all the information being presented was essentially textbook info, which you don't need to cite, especially since the person reading your paper is most likely an expert in this field, like Gloria mentioned. Whereas the second one kind of incorporated a little more like stats and info like that. So it required citation. Okay, so talking about the conclusion, your conclusion essentially acts as a summary of your findings. And at this point, there shouldn't be any references because you shouldn't be adding any new information. And it should highlight points that touch on kind of translational results, potential clinical relevance, and gaps that could get covered by future research, especially. And personally, I like to conclude with that type of information in my own conclusion. So it's like my last sentence, essentially. And it kind of emphasizes to your reader that you're considering the impact of what you've covered, and it highlights potential directions that the field could go into. It kind of always gets your bonus points in papers like this. So we can go over some examples as well. So yeah, so kind of similar for both of these. These last kind of statements talk about future directions and clinical impact. And I think readers just in general really like to understand the importance of what you've read and why you've read. Okay. So now we can talk about general tips. So in general, it's better to be using definitive and active voice in your writing. It makes you sound more confident in the things that you're discussing, and that always is a positive thing. And you should also be paying attention to the tense that you're using and making sure that you're not switching between past and present. You should be using formal language, so avoiding personal pronouns and making sure that the writing and the style of writing that you're choosing fits into the academic context. Use of acronyms. So I think the general rule is that if you're using a phrase like, for example, patent vectors arteriosus or PDA more than 4 times, you can shorten it to PDA. And for the entirety of the paper following that acronym shortening, you should be only using the acronym. So you shouldn't be switching back. And then citations, like Poria mentioned, keeping it consistent to the style that the reader or the syllabus essentially has asked for. I believe it's American Journal of Physiology that's typically used for this class. So yeah, making sure that you're using that citation style, because you can't get doc marks if you're using the intro. So those are all the general tips. We can hand it back to Poria then.
All right, and that pretty much concludes our general overview of the term paper. I know we didn't discuss too much about the actual body of the paper. There is a document that was made by a couple of our collaborators that I will share with everyone who's here today, and you can go through that. It talks a little bit more about the point-by-point breakdown, but honestly, I think that if you do a good job in the actual research portion, the body will come naturally, as long as you stick to the general guidelines of the writing tips. The most important areas that I think a lot of students struggle with is that introduction and conclusion, because it's the first impression in your introduction, and it's really the taste that you're leaving, the aftertaste that you're leaving with your reader in the conclusion. So those are really important, and I think the body will just come as you research more and get a better sense of what the field is offering.